American dialects in literature. Is American English something that crosses boundaries of region, that crosses boundaries of class and culture? Is American English in effect the sum of its regional forms? In my last lecture, I tried to identify some of the features of American regional dialects and call attention to the way in which original settlement patterns spawned or developed different dialects areas. I also called attention to the way in which some of the resources of contemporary dialectology and lexicography, notably the Dictionary of American Regional English, still explicitly ground their project in the 19th century debates about national linguistic identity and also about the relationship between amateur desire, the ardent fascination with language on the one hand, and the need to create a systematic historical methodology on the other. In this lecture, I'd like to develop some of these issues by looking at the literary representation of American dialects, and I'm going to try to read a few passages in American regional dialect. I'm going to call attention to vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, and I'm going to call attention to some issues as well of pronunciation. But I want to stress here is that I am trying very hard not to caricature speech, even though some of these literary representation may be caricatures, and even though they may be written individuals who were not themselves members of the regional or the ethnic or the class speech community they represent. Numberless, their literary representations may provide us with evidence for the historical pronunciation and the historical grammar of certain regions in America. They may provide us with the evidence for the survival or certain forms of folk speech or folk idiom in American culture. And they also provide us with examples of narrative, and the thing that I want to stress is that regional or folk speech is not simply the sum of funny words or strange pronunciation. It is the form of narrative. It is a way of telling a story. And so what I'll be stressing here all the ways in which American regional experience tells a story. Now, in representing dialect and literature, we come across other example of an issue I've been talking about, the rote discourse, and that is dialect. How do we create the impressions to evoke the illusions of someone speaking non-standard English? We may write it says as S-E-Z for says, S-E-S-A-Y-S, and the pronunciation of says and says may be actual identical, but by writing as S-E-Z or by writing W-A-N-N-A for Wana or G-O-N-A for Ghana, even though this may be the ways in which most people pronounce what and what to do and I'm going to do this, we don't think of this as necessarily uneducated or dialectical. These forms of dialect designed to evoke regional affiliation or level of literacy of level of class. In other words, what being a vote is how the individual might write the word where that individual to write says. Let's say this a wonderful example in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, when the Duke and Dolphin are putting on a Hamlet and Huck as if they're gonna be an encourse, and the word encourse is spelled not E-N-C-O-R-E-S but encourse, O-N-K-O-R-E-S, encourse. Now, when you say and you say in course regardless of how it's spelled, it may be the same thing, but the idea is to evoke by using a particular spelling the unusualness of the word or the way in which it is pronounced or stressed. In other words, are there going to be an in course, as if I want you to know that I know this high concept of francophone word. So the issue of I dialect is central to the problem of literacy representation, and in mentioning Twain, I call attention to probably the most famous figure in the literary representation of dialect in America. He's best known for his attempts in books like Huckleberry Finn to try to represent the accurately and sympathetically the language of Missouri white and African American speech in the middle of the 19th century. Now Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn in particular forms, which I will be drawing, is set in the 1840s, but it's written on generation later. And Twain is no longer living in the Missouri of his childhood. Twain in mature life lived in Elmira, New York. He lived in Hartford, Connecticut. Twain is enclosed in the American Northeast establishment, and so there is an issue also a representation of dialect that is very key to the issues of nostalgia. And I want to stress this, in other words, in looking at dialect at all, going back not simply to something that is original or authentic in America. Are we going to back in effect to the childhood of America? This regional dialect stands to standard English as childhood speech, stand to adult speech, and therefore when writers go back to set works in the time of their childhood, are they going to are they going so to create the impression that their characteristics in a sense are not simply children, but that the speech of the time and place is somehow immature on the one hand, or perhaps more authentic and felt on the other hand? I'm going to do my best. With Twain and hers, a moment in Huckleberry Finn where Tom says, "I know how to fix it. We got to go. Have a rock for the coat of arms and mournful inscriptions, and we can kill two birds with that same rock. There's a goody big grindstone down at the mill, and Walls mouth and crave the thing on it, and file out the pants and the sew on it too." Now I breathe this lightly because there's almost no I dialect in Tom's speech, but when Huck, who is the narrator, speaks the rights, there is a numerous amount of I dialect. Warrant no slouch of an idea, and warrant no slouch of a grindstone either, but we tackle it. Weren't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the meal, leaving Jim at work. We smoked the grindstone and set out to roll her home, but it was a most nation-top job. Sometimes we couldn't keep her from falling over, and she came mightily near mashing us. Every time Tom said she was going to get one of us sure before we got through. We got her halfway, and then we was palm played out and most grounded with sweat. We see it warrant no use. We got to go and fetch Jim, so he raised up his bed and slayed the chain of the bed leg and wrapped it around his neck and crawled throughout our holes and down there and Jim and me, and laid into that grindstone and walked her along like nothing. And Tom superintended. He could out superintended any boy I ever see. He know the how to do everything. I think that this is hack speech. Now what I've tried to do is call attention not just to particular sounds but to particular grammatical issues, and as I stress, when Huck writes a speak, there's more I dialect than when Tom does so. It seems clear that Twain wants to represent Huck's speech either more accurately on the one hand or more regionally on the other. So what do we see in this passage? We see as a spelling like Warren accurately in the hand and more regionally on the other. So what do we see in this passage? We see a spellings like WARN apostrophe T. We see NOTHER. We see WRAPT. Warrant. Other warp is this pure I dialect, and it is designed not to transcribe phonetically and sound of speech. It is designed to evoke the flavor of pronunciation. When we talk about morphology, that is the way in which the forms of the words are represented to indicate grammatical distinction. We can see a characteristic original or folk speech in words like grounded and node. We see the multiple past instead of the participial from form drawn and known in the course of the narrative. I read as well, we can see something that is characteristic of folk or regional narration, and that is an oscillation or a variation between telling a story as something that happened in the past and telling a story as something that is happening in the present. So if you go through a passage like this, you look at the sentence of the verbs, what you'll see is that some of them are in the past tense, cleared out smudge and grindstone. We couldn't keep her, Tom said. We was palm. And then on occasion, there is a present tense. We see if warrant no use, we got to go. And this kind of isolation between the present and the past, as I think characteristic of folk narration. So I say to my son Aaron, I says, and here an example again of the way in which we narrate in the present. What also interesting is the vocabulary words like smudge, meaning to steal, or nation through tough job. This is euphemism. A euphemism is the use of an elaborate or heightened word or phrase to cover up a potentially offensive or absence. From now, what's very interesting is the way in which nation becomes a regional euphemism. You have a damned tough job, you have a damned nation, tough job, and therefore you have a nation, tough job. Palm played out, these are the landmarks of regionalism here, and what's also interesting is the way in which hypercorrection can be the landmark of regionalism. That is one of the things that very interesting about the passage, is the way in which it hacks voice. You have this regional, local, and vocabulary, and then you have something exceedingly learned, and that is superintended. Tom superintended. What Hack does is he uses this word, and then his narration becomes exceedingly self-conscious about it. In other words, it's almost as if he is surprised to hear that word in his mouth or coming from his pen, because it is a learned term, and so what he wants to do is use it in a kind of hypercorrect form, that is issue it in a way that makes a new word so that it seems as if Hack is genuinely learned it, and so he out superintended any boy I ever see, and this combination of out superintended as a kind of nonce of coins and I ever see instead of I ever saw. The return to folk regional narrative present he knows how to do. Everything this collation of grammatical terms bring out the uniqueness of the nouns term out superintended and its contribute to the regional flavor, I think, more than any form of pronunciation of Twain. Other important writer of the 19th century who is best known for his presentation of regional English is Joel Chandler Harris. In his Uncle Remus stories, and he seeks to represent the language and the culture of the African American slaves of the mid-19th century. In particular, the Piedmont district, about also there are some aspects of his writing that point to regional speech and forms and idioms farther south around the banks of the Mississippi. And here is a passage from A Run of Luck, and I want to look at this for its representation of this version of African American speech in a subsequent letter. I'm going to do into some detail about the history of features of American English, and I want to stress here that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to recreate the sounds and forms of speech that Chandler Harris is illustrating with his I dialect, and so it goes something like this. Well, sir, he said, after a while, a camera went off with my younger master. I speak out of gun of had any chillin, I bet he ain't had a blast one, and it looked like to me such that the Lord going to stand me by a man who went going chillin, but that ain't no. So I done been out per Mississippi with my young master, and that one time was too much for me. First year was the repeat on the steamboat, and then it was the burn of the boat, and then come and swamp, and then the cane breaks. And I tell you right now, I don't know which was to repeat on the boat, or the fire, or the swamps, or the cane breaks. That ain't no country like on Sir. There's enough water in the station master ship, or the float Noah's Ark. It's in their land what they plant the cotton, sir. The ground is mushy and black, you may believe me, sir, but there was times when I was out there that the author made 7 pence for to get a whip, a dish, your red dash up my nose when you come to farm, sir. Give me the red line of the grade. It may not make as much cotton in one season, but I last longer and it's lots more wholesome. So what is characteristic of the speech that Joel Chandler Harris is trying to evoke here by using particular spelling? Forms. What is characteristic is the dropping of the final R sounds, and saucer is spelled S-U-H. So you get not only the lack of the R, sir, instead of sir, but you also in the U form in the spelling, you can lowering of vowel. So instead of sir, but you have the inclusion of R in a word like master, which is spelled M-A-R-S-T-E-R instead of master. You see various grammatical forms that scholars have subsequently recognized characteristic of African American English. It is what we might call the use of the directive in the praise I done been. Now this is I will call attention to answer in a subsequent lecture, not an issue of ungrammatical or illiterate speech, but it is something perfectly consonant with the grammar of African American English, which uses durative aspect rather than tenses. In the other words, it calls attention using them being to action that are ongoing, and I'm going to call attention to this in greater detail in my lecture on African American English. The thing that I want to stress now is the This is an evolution of the grammatical features of language rather than an evocation of literary C. In other forms, Mississippi is reduced to Mississippi, is reduced to Marxism. The TH sound is consistently written as the, so instead of there and, them, there and dim, and occasionally you have phrases where the G is dropped, so instead of burning you have burn. For example, now it seems to me that what is also fascinating about a passage like this is not simply the pronunciation or the grammar, but the vocabulary, and there seems to be a word in this passage which simplifies to me the nature of this problem of vocabulary, and that's the word can break. That is this particular swamp. There are cane breaks, and cane break is a word that shows up if you look up in the DARE as early 1770. It is the 1810 and 1836 quotation. It appears in DARE Women to the 1970s, and what it makes clear is that the canebrake is particular kinds of vegetation growing on the banks of the Mississippi in a certain area, and other words that is a particular local world word that designed to evoke a very special time and place, but also that this is a word that fits into the narrative spectrum of Chandler Harris African American way of telling the story, and that is the future of narration here. This is a story, if you follow it through, this is the story about disaster on a river. Well, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn has a story about disaster on a river, but now the illusions make it very, very different because there's enough water in their stage of massacre to float Noah's Ark. Now, as soon as you make the occasions that there's enough water in the state of Mississippi to float Noah's Ark, what you're doing is you're associating your story with biblical narrative, and you are giving the story now not simply the flavor of folk narration, but the flavor of pulpit oratory, that is in effect a sermon, and the nature of the sermon is to bring us back, as we saw in Frederick Douglass' story of the runaway slave, to the ways in which the African American experience is so frequently an experience of alienation and experience of being lost, that the swamp or the river or the disaster that are represented here as are figures of the swamp in which the African American experience in the 19th century was represented, and the language here is so much a language of the story of the African American slave. The ground is mushy. The ground is mushy. The ground is always mushy when they deal with American region dialect rares the class, and we should not let ourselves be swamped by these details or by the fear of caricature in our decision. Now, when we move north and we look at couple of passengers that are representative of different region in American English, we might turn to the late 19th century Maine writer Sarah Orne Jewett. In her story Andrew's Fortune, she illustrates the literary representation of Eastern New England dialect, the so-called down Eastern form Maine, and you have a poor couple discussing here. We was dreadful concern to hear cousin Stephen's death. So the poor man he went there, is sad and didn't a great loss. He is advanced to say, yes, he was very much look up to, and was sometime before the air packed up courage to speak again, and his wife and me was laughing on getting over the funeral, but it's a great way to ride and was P6. Since the day that I should been troubled more than common with the P6 since the cold weather came I was all creeped up with the rheumatism. We want neither of us fit to be out. It was all I could do get out the bond to feed the stock. While Jonas and Tim was gone, my voice was over. I suppose you know I don't know their come to speak with you, their background with strangers, but they good, steady fellows. Then was the Loud's hat was hanging around at the burn. I guess said Betsy to yourself, they're the mainstay now there I had poor me already. Jonas has got a raising $100 laid up, and I believe Tim's got something too. Yes, younger, you know, so Chewat uses I dialect to indicate the characteristic vowels of the main town east. So he spells great, G-R-E apostrophe T, great, and steady, S-T-I-D-D-Y, it's steady. In addition to this, there are several words, there are several vocabulary terms that locate the speakers a member of the class as well as a region. For example, the use of such apparently ungrammatical expression is dreadful. Concern for my voice was over, but my favorite just is is my favorite representation, my emblem, if you like, of the language of Joel Chandler Harris. My favorite here is music, and it's spelled P-H-T-H-I-S-I-C. It is physical ailment. Now, what is physic? If you go through the dictionary of American Regional English, as I will do right now, and you look up physics, what you get is any of a variety of condition producing coughing or difficulty in breathing, especially as Maria uses the name of an imaginary illness, hence physically affected by such a condition, asthmatic or wheezy, and is tested as early as 1806. Now it's quite clear that physics is not just dialect term but a very technical regional term, and this spelling PHTA is designed to evoke the spelling of critical element from Greek science. That is the way which science coins word on Greek models. So there is an element of the pseudo scientifically Greek in here, but there's a fascinating entry from the DARE from 1975, and here's the quotation that they give from an author who's writing about the main language, and the author says that physics is sometimes spelled P-I-Z-Z-I-C. It is included here because somebody who didn't know how to spell it suggested it was a good mean word. Physics is in any good dictionary. It's specular of orthography made a favorite in all-time spelling bees, and until spelling bees went out of style, almost all readers could spell physics. Now you can a wonderful sense here that the ideas is that is a word is start short of lives in the spelling bee. It's a trick word, it's a main word, it is a dictionary of word. Physics isn't any good dictionary to go back to the praise good dictionary. Remember when I read that selection from Webster, ninth a good dictionary was is a good dictionary to the mark of a good dictionary can be many things is the mark of a good dictionary 81 that has the word physics in it is spelled correctly. Now I want to read one more passage and then summarize some of the issues that I want to raise here, and the passage I'm going to read is from Marjorie Kenham Rowling's My Friend Mo, And this is the evolution of the Crocker speech, and I'm not going to stress the pronunciation as much in this, but what I want to call attention to are a couple of the terms, and again the words, the grammar, and the narrative. As you work to notice the rule of glass jars of huckleberries that I canned his grave face brighten now that's the way to live, he said. All the good things we got here in Florida, blueberries, blackberries, beans, and cowpeas, all the things that ought to be canned and put up on a clean covered shelf with white paper on it. That's the way Mama did she live. Find out the way you live, but just a good when it comes to canning things and keeping things clean. His face dark. I've done tried go to go to get my wife. I do it that way, but it just ain't no use. One time, about 2 dozen glass jars, and I went out by myself, and I picked about a blackberries, and I went to store both a 25-pound sugar, and I take it home, and I said, "Wife, here's a bit of blackberries put up for us, and jam and jelly for the winter." He settled his loyalty picking him. She probably didn't have time to do it. I suggest she had time. She let them blackberries spoil. The answers got in the sugar, and I found the jars throughout the backyard. Now, what we have here seems to be a narrative that is much about language as it is about marriage, but here the man is complaining how we went out and go and got all these blackberries and cut all these glass jars, and he hoped that his wife would can him and preserve him, and she didn't want going on technical in this passage. Justice we saw cane breaks and physics, so I want to focus on answer here's the answers given. The sugar, you have the again regionalism of the past tense shown out in the backyard. You have illusion in regional speech. You have the use of o or for of. You have a bathe. You have large amounts. You have all these issues that came together to evoke not just a particular region, but if you like, the very idea of regionalism. But I want to pause now, and I want to call attention to some things that so many of this passage have in common, and that is I think these are really stories about the place of the regional and American literary culture. Let me ask if this way is dialects comfortable to answers in the sugar is the American language, the sugar of our lives, and this is didn't something which is like a set of ants and getting, and in fact it by contrast is the study of language, like putting up blackberries where we go out and we collect all of the varieties, and then I as a teacher bring in my pristine sterile glass jar to preserve these berries for your delectation. And yet what happened to the end? The blackberries spoiled, the ants has gotten the sugar, the jars were thrown out in the backyard. As Samuel Johnson said, to try to record to fix a language like trying to lash the wind to enchain a syllable is like trying to lash the wind, and we saw how the Mississippi River in North Noah's Webster is Mark Twain and Joel Chandler Harris stand as an emblem of language itself, constantly following, constantly changing, constantly mutating. The English language in this passage is something that is being represented, being evoked, if you like, through a dialect and special spellings. But what I think so many writers on dialect of organize and what so many of the writers and I've quoted from have recognized as well is that we may try to, if you like, put up dialect in the glass jars of our lexicons we may go through one night and smudge a gaudy big grindstone of the regional we may wish at some moment to tell a story and the physics come up upon us and breaks in that it is it no accident that physics is an ailment that has to do with breath, an ailment that has to do with the sound of speech. And so when we think about regional dialect, when we think about the way is and which America is nation of areas and classes, regions, social, ethnic, and linguistic. So we need to ask ourselves if the sugar of our tongue has been tainted by the answers of a fun fact what early makes America so tasty are those blackberries in the glass jars of our imagination.